I'm Danielle Khan from the former Zoning Revisions Committee, and this is Dylan Sussman, also on the ZRC, and as you know, Stephen was on it. And we're here to give you some highlights of the final report that you received last week of the Zoning Revisions Committee. They are just highlights. We chose not to address everything in there, but to just address some of the more key and or confusing things in there. So as you know, our process, we met 2 times a month for 2 years, and we analyzed existing zoning and the Sustainable Northampton Plan, and we did all kinds of public outreach to collect community input, including 5 public forums and a lot of informal public input as well. And we developed a process that may or may not be useful to you as you move forward in the future with zoning revisions, but it was sort of a simple process to help us think about how we want to relate community input to the process of also analyzing and synthesizing and understanding things, and how we want to take community input and get it into recommendations. And so you can see there's some feedback loops throughout the process where it may be appropriate to sort of go back through it again. But basically, this is the process. We didn't always follow it religiously, but we tried to. So analysis and synthesis, followed by focus group input, then public input, that was the forums, and then recommendations, and then occasionally going back and trying again. Some of the key recommendations from the report were, so starting with some of the zoning goals that the Zoning Revisions Committee developed. One of the early things that we did is we took some time to boil down all of the everything in the Sustainable Northampton Plan, all of the goals, objectives, and strategies, into a really short set of summary goals that would be useful to us in making zoning revisions. So sort of as a lens to consider zoning changes as we went through our discussions. And those summary goals, which we hope will also be useful to you in the future, are to concentrate development and allow for a wide range of housing types and workspaces in walkable mixed-use neighborhood, village, and commercial centers. To not get a virus. To minimize development in areas that lack infrastructure or have significant environmental open space or agricultural resources. To promote environmental performance, including energy and resource efficiency. To make the zoning code easier to understand, and to promote design that fits into our neighborhoods so that new development can make the city a better place. Some of the key recommendations from our report, I've broken them down here a little bit more clearly in certain ways into long, medium, and short term. The bulk of the report really had short term and medium term recommendations in it. But in the long term, the Zoning Revisions Committee did discuss on numerous occasions that we would recommend that the city invest in a comprehensive effort to restructure and rewrite the entire zoning code. While it is useful to have a piecemeal approach and to keep making progress, it is something that a lot of cities, many cities, are increasingly looking at and investing in, and we realize that it takes money and resources and time to do it, but we think it would be a worthwhile endeavor for the city. In the medium term, address parking issues in dense residential neighborhoods, both through zoning and also taking a look at non-zoning solutions such as residential parking permits in some of our denser residential neighborhoods. And in the short term, the bulk of what our report includes, we have recommendations for revising urban agricultural provisions, particularly relating to backyard chickens, revising home business provisions, revising accessory apartment provisions, plan development, looking at dimensional standards in urban residential districts, establishing design standards for larger projects, developing a non-binding design guidebook to help people see what would be compatible in the city, and taking steps to make the zoning easier to understand. And so I'm going to go straight into, we're really going to focus on 2 big pieces of our report here, the home business provisions and then the recommendations relating to the urban residential districts of the city. So currently, when we looked at the current regulations, we found that a home occupation doesn't require a special permit only if no customers or clients are seen on the site, there's no sign for the business, there's no sales of goods from the premises, and you don't meet or work with anybody else in your house ever. And if a home business activity doesn't fit that narrow definition, a special permit is required. And the special permit can allow you to get a small sign, can allow you to sell some goods from the home or up to one other person to work with you. So we set a goal of trying to allow, to change home business provisions in the city to allow many types of home businesses by right, but to really think carefully about how we could minimize the impacts of home businesses on the residential neighborhoods, and to allow current illegal home businesses to operate legally. And some of the strategies that we decided on as a group were to regulate, instead of regulating customers and clients and a lot of things that sort of relate back to the thing we care about, to actually try to regulate the thing that we care about, which is what are the impacts of home businesses in our residential neighborhoods, and usually that comes down to traffic. So we decided to regulate auto traffic instead of those other things. And we also talked a lot about how we could make zoning provisions that don't distinguish between different types of visits. So why should we be treating an employee visit differently than a client visit when they all create the same impact on the neighborhood, which is somebody could come in a car. Some of the benefits to sustainability of the home business proposal that we're going to be talking about are it supports infill and uses existing structures for multiple purposes. So we've got sort of mixed use benefits. It supports entrepreneurship, lowers the barriers to small business, and equity. What we've proposed applies to all kinds of work equally, not just white-collar businesses, but also homemade goods and other sorts of businesses. And we believe it will reduce traffic and use of non-renewable resources. So coming back to sort of the benefits of telecommuting, more people working in their homes and closer to home and fewer traveling to work. Cost of doing business in Northampton, and finally reduces regulations. So we think that our proposal will allow for a lot fewer special permits to be required. So here's our proposed definition. A home business is conducted entirely within the buildings on a property, does not cause any outward manifestation that's uncharacteristic of the neighborhood. So here's where we're talking about traffic, noise, air pollution, that sort of thing. And we've also proposed here to just outright exclude certain kinds of businesses: clinical, medical, dental, veterinary, restaurant, retail, and so on. Some other provisions that we are proposing to apply to both by right and special permit home businesses are that they are secondary to the use of the dwelling for residential purposes. Somebody who works in the business, at least one person who works in the business, also has to be living in that home. Doesn't occupy more than 40% of the floor area. No goods are sold from the premises except if created in the home. We'll talk about that in a minute. Or sold by sort of electronic transaction. Again, doesn't produce noise, obnoxious odors, nothing that you could detect off of the property line. And again, and sort of got to conform to the codes. You can have a small sign by right, not by special permit, attached to the building, not lighted. And if it's an accessory structure, that structure needs to conform to the setback requirements unless you go through the ZBA findings process. And finally, the business must be registered with the city, including sort of the characteristics that that business is proposing. When is it going to operate? How many trips is it going to generate a day? So looking at just the by right provisions, the additional by right provisions, a home business would be permitted by right with our proposal if there's no outdoor storage of materials, merchandise, or equipment. Up to 2 open studios to sell homemade goods would be permitted per year. No more than 30 automobile round trips could be generated by the business in any given week, with a maximum of 7 in a day, and the hours of operation would need to be between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. A special permit could be requested if the business would like to request to be able to generate more than 30 automobile trips in a week, generate more than 7 in a day, operate out of those business hours, hold more than the 2 open studio functions a year, or to store outdoor materials provided that those materials are not visible from the street or adjacent properties. And so just to reiterate, I know I sort of said this already, but all those other provisions that I already said before, so can't occupy more than 40% of the floor area, can't be a nuisance to the neighborhood, so on and so forth, still apply to the special permit uses. And just to keep this going, we'll do questions at the end. I'm going to start on zoning in traditional neighborhoods. As you all know, we spent a lot of time as a committee looking at the zoning in our traditional neighborhoods of the city. And I'm going to start this, and then Dylan's going to pick it up with our proposal. You probably have all seen this slide already before, but we were really, really shocked to find out that a huge, huge percentage of the homes and lots in our traditional neighborhoods don't conform to the current zoning. And you can see in URC we had 63% of 1 to 3 family homes don't conform to the current zoning, 83% of 4 family homes. In URB, 32% of 1 family homes, 62% of 2 family, 82% of 3 family. And in URA, 35% of 1 family homes and 100% of 2 family, because they're not allowed, don't conform to the current zoning. And we talked a lot about this as a committee because it was a pretty shocking thing to realize. None of us knew it before we started this project. And it matters, this matters because it means that our zoning doesn't match our current neighborhoods, our best neighborhoods, our existing traditional neighborhoods in our city. There really is a big disconnect between our current zoning and the traditional neighborhoods that we have and love. And also it means that we have these great urban neighborhoods that can never be built again. For example, when a home goes from 2 family to 1 family, it can never go back up to 2 family. So, and there's some other effects that happen there too, where you can lose housing units over time and that kind of thing. You've also probably seen this slide. This is when we sort of tested some of our findings on a single street in Northampton. The diagram on the left shows X's on all the properties that don't conform on Walnut Street, just looking at lot size. That doesn't look at setbacks, that doesn't look at coverage, that doesn't look at frontage, doesn't look at anything else. So it's very likely that there's nothing on that street that conforms. But this is just looking at lot size. 84% of those homes, those could not be built today. And then looking at another house on Elizabeth Street, this 2-family home couldn't be built today at all. It couldn't even be a single-family home today because it doesn't meet the minimum lot size requirements for URB. We also found that innovative infill housing isn't allowed in our neighborhoods. These are some examples of cottage and pocket housing that we looked at. We found out that although adaptive reuse of historic buildings are allowed in our downtown district, they're not allowed in our residential districts. And here's an example. I know you looked at this earlier with what Wayne was showing you. Here's an example of the church in Leeds. They can't be converted for infill housing because it is in a residential district. So you can't really adaptively reuse our obsolete buildings. And so in the course of all this analysis, infill really rose to the surface for us as a critical issue for sustainability. We defined it pretty broadly as new construction or redevelopment that fills in empty lots or adds units or uses in areas that are already developed. And we found that we talked about how it's an important tool for concentrating development into walkable neighborhoods rather than promoting sprawl into the undeveloped areas of the city. And finally, we think it's important because it actually is the historic pattern of development in Northampton, and we like that. And we think that we've heard that the community likes those traditional neighborhoods, and we'd like to perpetuate that. Now I'm going to hand it over to Dylan to talk about what we are proposing.
Okay, so just to review what I just said, basically the Sustainable Northampton Plan calls for concentrating development in traditional neighborhoods. For our purposes, traditional neighborhoods are the urban residential districts, URC, URB, and URA. Currently, the zoning basically is causing a decrease in the density of existing neighborhoods, whereas the Sustainable Northampton Plan says there should be an increase in the density. So infill basically is that increase in density. It's the way it happens. So what are the sustainability benefits of allowing additional residential infill? On the environmental side, if you have more people living within walking distances of businesses, there's less driving happening if they're walking. Flexible reuse of existing buildings like those churches that Wayne was talking about, and the Clark School is more energy and resource efficient than building new buildings. It's more efficient to renovate and reuse than it is to build new. On the economic side, if we have more people living within walking distance of goods and services, there's more of a customer base for our businesses. Also on the economic side, allowing more flexibility for residential property owners means that they can potentially have increased rental income, which will help them pay their underwater mortgages. And also more disposable income. If you're driving less, you have more disposable income because you're using your car less. And then finally, on the equity side, there are a lot of people who want to live within our traditional urban neighborhoods who either can't find housing or can't afford it. So infill is a way to create more housing units, which could potentially bring down prices and or just have more supply for people. There are considerations to allowing more infill, and we heard some of these in our public forums and in our meetings. So while having more concentration in traditional neighborhoods can lead to those people driving less, there are going to be more total drivers within traditional neighborhoods, so we don't fully know the effects on traffic. New construction can be beautiful, but neighbors can also think it's not so beautiful, and we're going to talk about design later. And finally, infill can reduce the need for expensive new infrastructure in the outlying areas of the city, but it puts more strain on existing infrastructure. So infrastructure needs to be studied in tandem with zoning changes. So here are some proposals. First proposal is to amend the accessory apartment provisions of the zoning to make it easier to have accessory apartments in owner-occupied single-family properties. The main way we're proposing to do this is to relax the standards for accessory structures being converted to accessory apartments. So currently, so basically we're proposing that if there's an accessory structure, like a garage or a carriage house, that was built before 1975, we're proposing that the owner of that property is allowed to add an accessory apartment in that existing structure, even if the structure is closer to the property line than the home, which is not the case currently. For structures that were built after 1975, we're proposing that they be allowed to add that accessory apartment if the structure is within 10 feet of the rear or front property line, which they can't currently do. And in URC, this be allowed to be reduced to 4 feet by special permit. We're proposing that this conversion take place by right rather than by special permit, and that the applicant be allowed to be not required to have the door to the accessory apartment in a detached accessory structure in the side or the rear, which is currently the case. Currently, the provisions require that the door is hidden, and we're saying you can have a door in the front if you want to, if it makes a difference. On the innovative housing side, we're proposing that the city, or recommending that the city amend its planned unit development regulations to allow for innovative housing types and also adaptive reuse. So Wayne went through some details of criteria for adaptive reuse. We're basically proposing that criteria like those, which we didn't sketch out, be put into planned unit development. A lot of our time was focused on small-scale infill within traditional urban neighborhoods, so URC, URB, and URA. And basically our approach that we finally came up with after talking about a lot in public forums was to revise the standard to allow for infill within existing lots, but to try and limit the splitting of lots into smaller lots, which would result in more new construction and a sense of less open space in the neighborhoods. So what we're trying to do is allow conversion of buildings, allow more flexibility within existing buildings and addition on existing buildings, but limit the amount of entirely new buildings and larger projects. So the recommendations I'm going to walk through apply to 1 to 4 family homes in URC, 1 to 3 family homes in URB, 1 to 2 family homes in URA. There are a couple of major points here. One of them is we're recommending that the link between the number of units and lot size be removed. So currently in URC, to have a single family home you need 6,000 square feet. To have a 2-family home you need 12,000 square feet. To have a 3-family home you need 18,000 square feet. to have a 4-family home, you need 24,000 square feet, which doesn't relate to the reality of what's in URC. So we're recommending that the link between number of units and lot size be removed. We're also recommending that lot sizes and frontages be reduced, but that they don't be reduced so far that lots will be split, that a lot of lots will be able to be split and there'll be houses between houses. We're also recommending simplifying the requirements overall and using a more form-based approach, so that we're regulating in terms of front and side setbacks is aimed towards a consistent streetscape that has the look we want, rather than varying based on the number of units that are on a property, which is the way it is currently. So one of those approaches that we're recommending is called dimensional averaging. This applies to front setbacks. So you take a street and measure the houses along a block face, in other words, from one intersecting street to another on one side of the street. Take all of the houses, measure their front setbacks, average them, and the new front setback would be the average plus or minus some number like 5 feet. So in this case, you've got a house that's got an 8-foot setback, a 16-foot setback, and a 12-foot setback. The new front setback for that block face would be 12 feet. And that's going to apply to all of the, we're going to walk through URC, URB, and URA. That applies to all of them. So our proposal for small-scale infill in URC, again, this applies to 1 to 4 family structures. It doesn't apply to 5 and above. Currently, the minimum lot size is between 6,000 and 24,000 square feet. We're proposing that it be reduced to 3,200 square feet. Currently, that's based on existing lot sizes. Currently, 70% of properties have lot sizes above 3,750 square feet. So basically, this would bring approximately 70% of lots into conformance based on lot size. Minimum frontage, we're proposing that it goes from 75 feet to 65 feet. Minimum depth, we're proposing that it be reduced to 45 feet. Front setbacks, again, is by dimensional averaging. Side setbacks, we're proposing that they be brought to 10 feet across the board, whereas they currently vary from 5 to 15 feet. The minimum rear setback, we're proposing goes from 20 to 30 feet to 20 feet, and that the building height, the off-street parking remains the same, the open space be 30%. So what does that look like? On the upper left there, you've got what's required for an existing one-family home in URC. This is existing zoning. On the upper right is the proposed changes. So you can see the lot size gets smaller. On the bottom left is what's required for existing. I get my laser to work there. Oh, interesting. It's not a laser. Okay. On the bottom left is a one-family home, and then each of those squares is the 6,000 square feet you need to add for an additional unit. And on the bottom right is our proposal for what you would need for a 4-family, basically, in URC. You can see that in the green there is the base lot size, but in order to meet the parking requirements, which wouldn't change, and the open space requirements, you would need to basically have a large lot. You could have so basically, parking requirements and open space determine how big your lot is more than the base zoning. But if you can fit 2-family in a 3,200 square foot lot, get your parking, get your setbacks, you can do it. For URB, we're proposing that the lot size be reduced to 5,000 square feet, the frontage be 65 feet, the minimum depth at 75 feet, and the side setback 15, rear 20, and again, minimum space 30%. Based on this, approximately 50% of existing 2-family homes would be in conformance based on lot size alone. So that looks like this. Currently, you need between 8,000 and 28,000 square foot for a 1 to 3 family home. This shows 1 and 2 family homes. The green is a 1 family home lot. The yellow is the addition you need for a 2 family home. And we're proposing on the right a 1 and 2 family home site, which is 5,000 square feet. And to my eye, looks a lot more like a lot in Northampton than the one on the left. URB 3 family homes existing, that's the lot size that's required. And on the right is the proposed lot size. Again, you would need more than 5,000 square feet to accommodate a 3 family home because of the parking requirements. And then finally, URA, we're proposing that the minimum lot size be 10,000 square feet for single families and 12,000 square feet for 2 families. That's not much of a change. The frontage stays the same. The depth goes from 100 to 80 feet. And the side setback, rear setback, building height, off-street parking requirements all stay the same. The minimum open space goes to 30%. That looks like this. Not much change there. So design standards. We spent a lot of time talking about design standards in the URC. I think going into it, we all thought that there should be a lot of detailed design standards. After talking about it in a couple of public forums, we basically determined that it makes sense to have design standards that apply only to larger projects in Northampton. So that's basically new construction that expands the footprint of the building by over 700 square feet. The footprint, 700 square feet. And that design standard should be general, so not regulating cornices and materials and the kinds of things that Central Business Architecture was talking about earlier in the night, but basically just how buildings relate to the street, how they relate to neighbors. And here are some suggestions for the kinds of things that we would think design standards should apply to. So,
Dylan, just want to do a time check. You got about 5 more minutes.
Great. So design standards should apply to, we recommend that they require that buildings not interfere with the solar access of neighboring structures. That where special permit is required, buildings should be oriented towards the street and demonstrate fit with the existing neighborhoods, with exceptions, of course, for neighborhoods in which buildings don't normally face the street. That tree preservation and replacement and front yard tree standards, shade tree standards, should be incorporated into design standards for larger projects. That there be a relief from dimensional standards by planning board site plan review. And that there be more detailed design standards for townhouses and larger developments. And finally, 2 last things. We're recommending that there be a design guidebook which is non-binding. It's written by the planning department or using CPA funds. That basically shows developers and property owners in Northampton what appropriate design is in Northampton. So they can look at this and they can see the kinds of architectural styles there are, the kinds of site layouts that are appropriate in Northampton, and be educated but not bound to follow the rules. And finally, overall, having attempted to understand the zoning for 2 years, it's very clear that it needs to be streamlined and graphics need to be added throughout to make it easier to understand. So just to remind you, our key long-term recommendation is that the entire zoning ordinance should be rewritten from start to finish. But in the meantime, we hope you'll consider the other changes we're proposing. So do you all have any questions in the last 4 minutes that are remaining?
Oh, in 4 minutes your proposal, but then we have 15 minutes for questions.
Oh, perfect. Well,
Excellent.
19 minutes, and we also have Peter here from the Zoning Revisions Committee, and that's it. Todd Breckman left.
Anybody said thank you lately?
What's that?
Has anybody said thank you lately?
You have. You're welcome.
Nice job. A lot of work.
I think it makes all the sense in the world if we put all that effort into the sustainable plan and the vision, and yet our zoning is going in a completely different direction, that we should have an overall comprehensive guidebook and plan and zoning and everything that kind of comes together.
Well, that was one of the things that was most striking when you first looked at, neighborhoods that everybody considered to be classic Northampton neighborhoods, North Maple Street in Florence or Walnut Street, in Ward 3. You couldn't build any of those neighborhoods today with the current zoning.
Right.
They wouldn't be allowed. So places that, I've lived in, we've all lived in, those neighborhoods wouldn't look anything like they do today. And that's, again, what we consider to be, the nice part of Northampton. So, it's interesting that the zoning has gotten to the point where it's so different than what's really there. And especially to promote infill, which is one of the big things about the sustainability plan, it's really hard to do because the way the zoning's wrong
Doesn't allow.
doesn't allow it. So, that and I think also one of the things we spent a lot of time at the end was the home business. I think that occupied 6 weeks or 2 months of our time towards the end, just to reflect the changing nature of the way people work now too. I mean, so many people work at home, either part-time or full-time, and the way the zoning is right now, most people would have to go get a special permit for what they do at home today, which people don't do. Nobody does. Nobody does. So. The other thing, I'm not sure if you guys want to open up for questions from the floor too. See if anybody.
Sure.
Sure.
I'm not sure if anybody from the public would like to comment on this or have any questions. But if you do, just raise your hand, state your name and address.
Steve Hathaway, 32 Northern Ave, covering Ward 3. Couple of questions is, have there been statistics gathered, have there been looks at current usage in these various URA, URB, URC to see how, I know you said there are most existing properties are out of conformance, but to see like by neighborhood how they correspond to your proposals. Are most of the lots bigger, smaller, about the same as your proposals, and by just sort of general neighborhood, how that compares. The second thing is I'm concerned that the proposed changes seem much more dramatic for URC than for URB and URA. That the effect is, and I don't know exactly where all the URC, URB, URA are, but the effect is to concentrate much more heavily in URC than it is already. And my guess is that URC is already the most dense areas. And is that really where we want to go? And finally, the other thing was, you were saying, pointed out, and so the report pointed out that most of the neighborhoods now could not be built with existing zoning. Has anybody looked into why the existing zoning is the way it is, and what their goals were at the time to put these rules in place?
Yeah, go ahead.
I can answer your third one quickly. I have looked into that quite a lot, actually. And in 1920, the city of Los Angeles developed the first Euclidean zoning scheme, which is a scheme that separates residential, commercial. It separates all the uses, which is sort of the opposite of what we've been talking about a lot today, which is more to get people in walkable neighborhoods that are mixed use, and things aren't quite as separated. And then after World War II, as people started moving out of the cities into the suburbs, basically they took that first zoning code that was developed in Los Angeles, and they sort of coupled it with with the values of the time: large lot development, suburban development, separating everything out, and they basically promulgated these model zoning codes around the entire country. And so most places adopted their first zoning codes at that time, and that's where ours came from as well.
But the idea was to push people out from the city center, make it a car-based zoning with big lots and big houses. You know, and the zoning, just so you know, the zoning didn't get, was it 1970? What was the year that Massachusetts adopted the zoning?
We've had
Yeah.
zoning since before that, but Northampton had sort of a big overhaul in 1975. Sort of it's more similar to what we have now than it was to all the other previous zoning codes.
And most of this neighborhood you think of pre-World War II, they were built before there was zoning.
Yeah. So, I mean, so it sounds like they just said we need to have a zoning code, and this is the one they found. There weren't any real goals.
Well,
I can't imagine the city said, well, we need to build up these giant.
Well, there was a goal. The goal was to develop that suburbs everywhere. So basically, regardless of what was on the ground, they just instituted that zoning code.
Right. But what I'm saying is there's a why for the current proposals. There's why are we doing this? There are lots of good reasons. It means the city doesn't have to spend millions of dollars running sewer and water way out, up to Hatfield and so on and so forth. That there's logic there. I'm not seeing any logic to building suburbs.
That's why we want to change it.
I can speak to your other two questions if you'd like.
Sure.
I think we certainly feel like there should be more study of what the effects would be of these proposals in terms of potential number of units created and how that would play out. In general, I think your perception that it's unequal is based on the degree of non-conformance that's existing in URC. So basically, URC is more off. The zoning in URC is more off from what exists than the other districts. So basically, what we did is we looked at what exists and we tried to make zoning that fit what exists. And when you do that, URC needs to change more to fit what's already there than URB and URA. Because the zoning overall tries to make things, kind of one uniform density, and that's not the way the city is. URC is more dense, URB is slightly less dense, and URA is slightly less dense than that.
Okay. So it sounds like the goal is more just to get the zoning in line with the current usage than to propose a direction for development.
It would allow more small-scale info, but it would also bring a lot. I mean, a big goal was to bring a lot of what's there into conformance, so that if you bought a three-family home in URC and you decided you wanted to put two of the apartments together to have more space to live for a while because you had kids, but then they grew up and left, that you could easily go back to a three-family. So part of it is that flexible conversions within a narrow range of small-scale infill over time.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry, did you have a question? You went first?
I was just going to say that as you add to the infill, right now we've had an enlightened government in terms of creating greenways and having an attitude of being able to move people to recreational areas. But it seems to me that as you add infill, you have to build in regulation that maintains a certain amount of recreational space that's in where people live, because it's just as bad to have to get in your car and drive to walk your dog or, recreate yourself. So you can end up with infill where everybody's driving to get out of the city. So it seems to me that you have to balance the infill with, types of parks and, that sort of thing. And that it needs to be part of the regulation as well, because the zoning will be something that once it's set, it's not going to change easily. So if that piece of it isn't worked in from the beginning, it could get shunted aside.
Yeah, Adam Cohen. If I can add to that also, urban gardening, especially in the past few years, has become very popular. Burpee sales of seeds is going through the roof. And so that's related to what you said, a consideration that if in these urban infill areas, which often happen to have very good soil because they're near the river, if you're wiping out space for home gardens, that's a factor. Not that I'm, I think there's a lot of good ideas in here. I'm very sympathetic to it. But that piece of green space is something that should be in the back of people's minds. Some of those, multifamily lots, I think the URB one with 3 families, not a whole lot of green space left on that lot once you accounted for the parking. Not a lot of room for gardening or kids' play area or what have you. That one concerned me a little bit. I'd also feel better about that one if there was a little bit of screening between the edge of that lot and whoever's next to it. Because I'd be worried about a scenario where someone takes something 2 to 3 family, needs more parking, and they go right to that lot line. Maybe they wipe out some trees, and suddenly they probably have a very unhappy neighbor on their hands. So maybe a couple feet at least of screening there in those scenarios might improve that a little bit. Thanks.
Just for Arnold Levinson, 14 Hancock. There are a couple of things that were said. I don't understand how infill is actually going to be bringing prices down. That concept is something I don't understand. And then the hours of operation from 7 until 8, that also is something that I wonder about. Since businesses downtown usually don't operate on that, why should we have businesses running from 7 o'clock till 8 p.m.? And then thinking about infill as a whole, we're talking about URC and URA and URB. There are portions of URA which are actually closer to mass transportation and other amenities areas. And I wonder why URA, why this whole concept was written in such a way to basically minimize URA involvement in infill. At least that's my impression, quite frankly.
The ZRC didn't have time to deal with map changes. So if there are areas of URA that are zoned incorrectly, that's not something we're able to deal with, and we hope that the planning board and other bodies deals with it. Regarding prices, that's my harebrained idea that if you have more supply for the demand, prices may come down. May not happen, but it could. In any case, there's still the equity issue of you have lots of people who want to live in a place and can't, and the zoning is preventing it from preventing property owners from making it possible that they can.
I wonder whether or not a young family wants to be in a small apartment or actually be someplace else where they could get a larger home, quite frankly. And admittedly, that doesn't fall into transportation hopes and so on. But certainly it would be great to have more apartments and so on. But I don't know whether or not that's actually going to be appealing to a young family who wants to come to town.
Well, let's give them a choice.
Anybody else have a question? So I think one of the things that we in the planning board are going to discuss, and I'm not sure what the agenda is for the meeting on the 11th, is what our next steps are now that we have the report. I mean, there's home occupation has been fleshed out a lot. We didn't get into, I guess, did you guys not have it in the presentation, was the chickens?
It seemed pretty self-explanatory, so we didn't want to take up a lot of time.
Chicken, like a lot of towns around Northampton that have been going into, people call it urban agriculture or whatever you want to call it, but one of the things the ZRC looked at was also to change the rules in Northampton for chickens.
Shouldn't we also expand the bunnies too?
And gosh darn it, everybody should have bunnies. So I think, so two of those things, the home occupation and the domestic urban agriculture, I was going to call it.
Just fowl at this point.
Fowl, just fowl. We're fairly well along, so I think if we have time at the August 11th meeting, we might want to start more in-depth discussions of how we're going to move some of this stuff forward. Obviously, the changes to URA, B, and C in terms of dimensions is going to be a longer-term process, but at least those two things are fleshed out far enough that I think we're ready to start having detailed discussions at the planning board. And then there was also the parking and transportation piece, Jim's part. The letter's in here, so we can discuss that as well. But I think in terms of how we're going to proceed, we should have time, depending on the agenda for the next meeting, to start talking about it. All right, any final thoughts, or?
Good luck.
Good luck.
You guys just want to get out of here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Did you get your thumb drive?
Yeah, thank you.
Any last thoughts?
What's that?
So what we might, so on the 11th, it might be time to start talking about this, and then figure out how we're going to move forward. Some of the stuff we'll have some more in-depth work. Some of the stuff is almost like 90% of the way there. So it's ready for us to just do a review and move it on to city council.
I think one thing you're so close to that, like how it fits in the open space plan, you know.
Oh, actually, yeah, because I've been working on this for 2 years too, so maybe you guys might need a little more background. So I think it's 90%. Yeah, there was a lot of detail in there, so, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so we might move a little slower than, but maybe if we all sat there for twice a month for 2 years.